Vladimir, I don't really know what's going on with ISIS, but things are getting out of hand. Oh my God, it's Janet Yellen. Vladimir, I'm gonna have to call you back. Take a seat here, Janet. It's been a huge week here on Capitol Hill. So much fiscal policy was conducted, believe me.
Wow, Donald, that's very impressive. I'm constantly dealing with monetary policy, and I'm afraid it's been a while since I've studied the fiscal policy that you conduct. Can you give me a quick refresher?
Absolutely. As you probably know, a stabilization policy is a macroeconomic strategy enacted by governments and central banks to keep economic growth stable. These policies are generally used to reduce the severity of recessions and rein in excessively strong expansions. So in this case, you are the central bank, controlling monetary policy, and I am the government, taking care of the economy's fiscal policy needs. So, now that you know the background of fiscal policy, I'll give you an idea of how exactly it works. As we previously stated, fiscal policy is conducted by a nation's government. It is the use of government spending, which is government purchases of goods and services and government transfers, or tax policy to stabilize the economy. Speaking of taxes, today, April 15th, happens to be National Tax Day. The government gets tax revenue on this day, which is a form of fiscal policy. What this means essentially is that the government is changing the way in which they conduct business to affect the overall state of the economy. A recessionary gap occurs when the aggregate output falls below potential output. The potential output is the LRIS curve. In this situation, the government can employ expansionary fiscal policy, where they basically give the economy a boost by cutting taxes, increasing government spending, and increasing government transfers.
What happens if the economy is doing very well? Will government still intervene then?
That is a great question, Janet. On the other hand, an inflationary gap occurs when the aggregate output exceeds potential output. Potential output, which we learned before, is the LRIS curve. In this case, contractionary fiscal policy would be used to rein in unusually strong economic expansions and close this gap. This is done by increasing taxes while decreasing government spending and transfers. Contractionary policy is seldom used, however, because higher taxes and slowing down the economy aren't generally things that voters like to see in their politicians.
Mr. President, you've taught me a lot about fiscal policy already, but what results from these policies that actually improves or slows down the economy?
The answer is actually quite simple. A change in government purchases directly affects aggregate demand. Government transfers and taxes, however, are indirect because they affect the disposable income of consumers, which is the amount of money they have to spend after the deduction of taxes and other charges. Ideally, with expansionary policy, consumers will have more disposable income, and with contractionary, they will have less.
Are there any other ways in which fiscal policy plays into the general economy?
There most certainly is. As you probably know, Mrs. Yellen, debt is the accumulated deficits of a nation minus the accumulated surplus. Yearly deficits contribute to the debt, so it is essentially the amount of deficit the country has accumulated over time. Debt is a problem with fiscal policy because it can lead to deficit spending, and a government with persistent budget deficits will experience more and more debt. When the economy begins to slow down in a recession, the government wants to spend to relieve the downturn, but it can't do this since it doesn't have the money. The government can't use tax revenue either, so it has to borrow the money in order to spend. When this happens, crowding out occurs, when the demand for loanable funds increases and interest rates increase, leading to a decrease in investment and other problems for consumers of the nation. Expansionary fiscal policy makes the budget deficit bigger, while contractionary policy makes the budget deficit smaller. The budget deficit almost always rises when the unemployment rate rises and also increases during recessions.
Wow, Donald, I didn't realize the complexity of the work that your government does to maintain a stable economy. I knew how much you love winning, but I think I might have you beat when it comes to stabilization. Fiscal policy seems very interesting, but in my honest opinion, monetary policy is far more effective in controlling the booms and busts of the economy.
I doubt that's the case, but I honestly don't know too much about monetary policy. Can you explain it to me?
Of course I can. Monetary policy is when we here at the Federal Reserve make changes to the quantity of money or the interest rate in order to stabilize the economy. During a recession, the money supply needs to increase, so there are three ways in which we can do this. First is with the reserve requirement. This sets the minimum amount of reserves that must be held by a commercial bank, and by changing this amount, we control how much money gets loaned out to customers. Banks create money by lending it out, so a decreased reserve ratio leads to an increase in the money supply, giving the economy somewhat of a kickstart. The next way is with the discount rate, or the interest rate the Fed charges on loans to the bank. When this is lower, more money is lent to banks and the money supply increases. And finally, the third method is with open market operations, or OMOs. These are the purchases or sales of government debt by the Fed. When the Fed buys government bonds, it receives the bonds while paying the money which goes into the economy, therefore increasing the money supply. Through all of these methods, the central bank can increase the quantity of money in circulation. This means that the households and firms will have more money at their disposal. The money supply increases, the interest rate falls, and the investment spending and consumer spending will increase. The aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, and the recessionary gap then closes.
So, what happens if the economy is doing really well?
It's pretty simple. They just do the complete opposite of what I just stated. For an inflationary gap, money supply needs to decrease to close the gap and to shift the aggregate demand to the left. This means that there will be an increased reserve requirement, so banks create less money, increase discount rate, so there are fewer loans for the banks, or sell bonds, so there is less money in the economy. This would decrease money supply, increase interest rates, decrease investment rates, decrease aggregate demand, slowing down the general economy. And we're not afraid to use contractionary policy because we don't have to be reelected.
Now I see what you mean. Monetary policy truly is an incredible tool to stabilize the economy. So, how does all this fit into the grand scheme of things?
Well, as we pointed out, these changes can be easily seen on the aggregate demand or aggregate supply graph. In addition to this, the changes of stabilization policies can be seen on the Phillips curve graph. This curve shows the relationship between unemployment and inflation rates. When a nation conducts expansionary fiscal or monetary policy, or engages in disinflation, there is movement to the left on the short-run Phillips curve. This movement creates an increase in the inflation rate and a decrease in the unemployment rate. The short-run Phillips curve represents the negative or inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. A movement upward on the SRPC is called SRPC demand pull inflation. This occurs when there is an increase in aggregate demand and it is an inflationary gap. An increase in aggregate demand leads to a fall in unemployment and an increase in the inflation rate. Increases and decreases of aggregate demand result in a movement along the SRPC. A movement downward on the SRPC because of a decrease in aggregate demand is called SRPC depressed economy. There is also the long-run Phillips curve. This shows the relationship between unemployment and inflation after expectations of inflation have had time to adjust to the experience.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Yellen. I feel like I know so much more about monetary policy and how it affects the economy now that you have enlightened me.
Same here. I am so much more knowledgeable on fiscal policy now.
I've had a great time, but I really need to get back to tweeting. I'll see you soon, Janet.
Bye, Donald.
Oh my god! It's Janet Yellen! Vlad, I'm gonna have to call you. Oh. I can't wait to. Oh my god! Oh my god!
Your voice, oh my god. We need to change something, like, laugh it out.
Okay. No.
No, I hate myself.